welcome everybody to the last of the White Bear Lake Historical Society's presentations around our Native American Education Initiative. And we're very lucky and pleased to have Wayne with us here tonight to share a little bit more about Chippewa or Ojibwe history within Minnesota. I want to do a couple of logistics quick before we get started, though. We do have both of the chat function and the Q&A function open to people if you want to submit questions. We will stop a couple times throughout the presentation tonight just to address some of those questions. And if this will also be recorded and posted on the Historical Society's YouTube channel later, if anyone wants to go back and watch it again or share it with other people, it will be up to share as well. And I guess we'll just hand it right over to Wayne. We'll get his PowerPoint back up and get started. So thank you, Wayne.
So, good evening, folks. Anin Anishinaabe. Hello, my fellow human beings. Indigenous Kaz Misquamiguan. My name is Misquamiguan, which means the Red Thunderbird. Nindodemo Wasasi. I'm from the Wasasi clan. Nagachi Wanang and Dunjaba. I'm also from the Fond du Lac Reservation. I live in the Sawyer district in the Fond du Lac Reservation. And I'm here to give a presentation on the history of the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe, which, when we talk about history of the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe, it has become the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe because there've been all kinds of efforts over the years to kind of divide and subjugate the Anishinaabe people that, that are from our homelands. And that, we have right now, we have, state boundaries. We've also got district boundaries, even within our reservations. Like for Fond du Lac, we have Cloquet, Brookston, and Sawyer. And each reservation has various districts as well, and they're probably voting districts. So there's a lot of division that has happened over the years. And although, Anishinaabe, we always strive for consensus in everything we do. And the boundaries, the state boundaries, as well as the international boundaries, divide our people. But that's how it is for today. And like I say, we'll talk about the history of the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe, which let's see if I can. No, I lost the there we go, more. I'll open up this PowerPoint that I have, and we'll kind of get into that history a little bit. I'll make some definitions and so on. So here we go. We'll share, and is that coming through, Elsa?
Not yet. You'll have to click the share, like the second share screen button that pops up.
The second share screen.
So you can select the window.
Okay, I see it.
Yep, there we go. We got it now.
How's that?
Looks good.
Good. So Minnesota Chippewa Tribe is what is called a confederation. In other words, we're loosely joined of 6 Chippewa bands located in the state of Minnesota. The 6 bands include the Boys Fort Band, Fond du Lac Band, Grand Portage, Leech Lake, Mille Lacs, and White Earth. And the tribe has a membership roughly around 41,000 people. And it makes it probably the largest tribe in Minnesota. The headquarters of the tribe is located in Cass Lake. And the tribe works to promote and protect the cultural and economic and social welfare of its members and descendants. So we'll get a little bit into the history of, how because maybe the English people didn't know the Anishinaabe language, they call us the Chippewa rather than maybe Ojibwe or Anishinaabe. And we ended up with Chippewa in the legal written form, and that's stuck, and we use that now as a description of ourselves. Actually, it's probably someone else's description of us, but um, that's that's the moniker that's stuck with the English language. So, um, and I think you can see my cursor here. Up in the northeast corner is Grand Portage Band. They retain most of their land. And then we move down southwest. This is the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. And up north is the Bois Fort Band of Chippewa. There's probably two locations there. We got the Leech Lake. This is Red Lake. That's not part of the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe. They're separate because they retained their land in whole by the tribe. And here's the White Earth Nation and the Mille Lacs Band. And let's see, I'll go on to the next slide. I can. So prior to the Anishinaabe or Chippewa people coming to Minnesota, our whole region there, these are many of the what's termed the Algonquin speaking tribes, and this was their territory. This is the Hudson Bay here where my cursor is, and way up almost to the Arctic Circle here. These were many of the Algonquin speaking tribes, way down into Tennessee and so on. And these are some of the names of the tribes that were located in this region: the Cree, the Montans, the Micmacs, Malasite, Abenaki, Penobscot, Mohicans, and so on. Sac and Fox, Kickapoo, Illinois, Shawnee, Potawatomi, Menominee, Ottawa. I don't think Winnebago will go by Ho-Chunk, Miami, Delaware, and so on. So as you can see, there were many tribes that were located around these Great Lakes since before 1500. And as it happens, the Ojibwe ended up here in Minnesota, at least the northern part of Minnesota. And I have to say too, as far as this area here in Lake Superior, many of the Dakotas lived here probably in the 1600s. I know that there's, like in Duluth, there's many stories of the Dakota living on the hills there in Duluth, and actually there's a story about, I don't know if people are familiar with Spirit Island, which is in the harbor or the estuary of the Chigamezebe or the St. Louis River, that it was in our prophecies as we migrated from the East Coast in the probably 1700s. So there, like I say, it's a long history of occupation by the various tribes. And some of the tribes migrated westward into present day Minnesota due to a variety of factors, which including warfare, disease, and pressure from European settlers. In fact, that our prophets said that, there was going to be pressure from foreigners. Well, they didn't call them foreigners in the day, and that's why we moved to the west from the Atlantic Ocean. And that migration started probably in the 900s. And so, we kind of had to adapt to a new environment here in Minnesota, and a little harsher winters and so on. So, you know, many of the indigenous tribes of Minnesota continue to maintain their cultural traditions and in spite of all the modern influences and the tribes are working to preserve their languages, ceremonies, and traditional knowledge to ensure that their heritage will continue to thrive for the future generations. Um, and I'll go to the next slide. This is uh, this is kind of the story of the seven fires, the prophecies that directed us to start this migration from the East Coast. We were living. This is the Atlantic Ocean up here in the St. Louis River, and many of the Anishinaabe inhabited much of this land here. And we followed the St. Louis River, and you know there were seven stopping points, and they also called them seven fires, which you know there were seven prophets that told us about our need to move. The first prophet said the Ojibwe would move west from the Eastern Ocean, or they would perish, and that they would know that they had reached the chosen land when they came to a place where food grew on the water. And that's Monoman or wild rice, which you know is Minnesota is probably one of the last places that you find it in abundance. There's Monoman in Wisconsin and a little bit in Michigan, but it's shrunk probably 90% in the last couple hundred years because of the kind of agricultural methods that have been used. So, but each of the prophets predicted parts of the Ojibwe story too. The coming of the light-skinned race or Europeans and the resulting generations of, you know, suffering when the people would become lost spiritually, emotionally, psychologically, and physically, and the loss of their lands, the taking of their children, and the banning of their traditional spiritual beliefs and the decline in Ojibwe language use, cultural practices, and ways of being. These were all prophesied. The seven prophets said there eventually would be a time of healing from the period of great suffering, and they described the cultural and spiritual kind of renaissance that the Ojibwe are experiencing today. You see many Ojibwe returning to the language and spiritual teachings and making efforts to live out the values of Mino Bimadaziwin, or the good path. And this is what the Great Spirit gave these values to the Ojibwe at the time of our creation. And you know, knowledge of these teachings of the seven fires is important for Ojibwe people because it reminds us we are part of a larger plan. As a result of the story that's told, and it's told, you know, repeatedly in ceremonies and so on, we know why we are here living in the region, including Minnesota, and we know why non-Indian, non-native people are here as well. Story reminds us why we came here, how historical events have shaped who we are today, and our role in shaping the way all of us as citizens of the earth should care for the air and the water and the land. That's in our teachings as well. So, and like I say, these were prophets that gave us direction and encouraged us to move west and where we finally ended up here in Minnesota. But we've got relatives in Wisconsin, Michigan, and so on. Also, you know, further west as far as Montana, actually. But there was a series of treaties that happened that helped. I don't mean to say helped in a good way, but shaped the areas that we live in today. I'll go to the next slide here. And so, you know, so we have the Treaty of 1854, Treaty of 1837. This one doesn't show the Treaty of, I think it was 1842 that kind of mapped out this land here, right on the south shore of Lake Superior. These are the 1855 ceded territories. This is 1866 was Boys Fort. It took them a few years to maybe have communication with the United States government saying, hey, you know, we're here and we need to have, so they became part of the 54 as well as the 66 there. And then the 1889 is what set aside Red Lake, but prior to that was the 1863 treaty. In 1863, you can imagine that's, you know, the Civil War is going on, and I did a little bit of research on that. I know that there's a spot where they held the treaty, and it was kind of in a bowl. I can't remember the name of the area there, but it was like I say, in a bowl, large bowl, and all of the tribe was down at the bottom of the bowl, and the United States government kind of surrounded that with Gatling guns and said, you know, we're gonna negotiate for this land, and that's how the 1863 treaty was initiated. But prior to all of this, you know, we had the first major impact as far as land cessation maybe started with the French into the Great Lakes region in the 1600s, and the resulting fur trade, which kind of shaped the economy, so to speak, where the Ojibwe and other tribes traded furs for guns, metal tools, pots, pans, utensils, cloth, and unfortunately, a lot of that was alcohol as well. I think I've read journal accounts where, you know, 3/4 of the trade goods that were coming via ship was rum, and the rest of it was the other kind of trade goods, the pots and pans and utensils and so on. And the fur trade kind of had a global impact on the economy because beaver were changed the European fashion, and made, you know, a lot of people very wealthy. John Jacob Astor, I think you can still see remnants of his empire around. Became rich as a result of the trade with the Ojibwe. The other concern there was the impact of European diseases on the Ojibwe was somewhat devastating. I was reading accounts of this was in 1889 when the Nelson Act was put in place. They went around to all of the tribes and they were encouraging or trying to influence them to sign on to this allotment act. It was called the Nelson Act in Minnesota, and that succeeded the Dawes Act of 1887. But the Nelson Act for Minnesota set aside all of the lands that weren't. They wanted to identify. First, they did a census of all the people, and then they identified all of the pine lands where the good timber was. And then they identified all the agricultural lands, but they wanted to allot 40 acres to each individual Indian, and anything that was left over, they were going to sell. So the lumber companies got very wealthy as a result of that. I think that was kind of the forerunner of the Weyerhaeuser Corporation and many other like endeavors here in Minnesota. And as you can see on the map here, 1854, we ceded the northeast region of Minnesota. And one of the reasons that the United States wanted that was because it was rich in timber for one thing, but also rich, so they thought in silver, and they thought there was gold as well as other minerals. They thought the copper was here like it was on the south shore of Lake Superior, Gitchigami. And in fact, part of, well, Fond du Lac Reservation is situated in Carleton County. And Carleton County is named after a man that was, he was the, they labeled him as the, maybe the blacksmith for the tribe when the treaty was made. But really what he was doing, he was kind of an assayer of a geologist, so to speak. His name was Reuben Carleton. And I believe he was signatory to the treaty as well, even though he was, labeled as the blacksmith. And he was one of the first legislators here in Minnesota. But his underlying responsibility was to look at the lay of the land and see where all the geological formations were. And that really was, the intention of the United States government to get the 1854 ceded territory. And, that was also in the 1850s. The United States wanted to move all the Ojibwe from Michigan and Minnesota west of the Mississippi. That was kind of the carryover of the 1830 Indian Removal Act that was imposed on the Cherokees, the Chickasaws, and so on. You heard of the Trail of Tears. In the 1850s, the United States wanted to move all the Ojibwe west of the Mississippi as well, and maybe use the Indian Removal Act as the justification for doing that. But there was lots of protests about that, not only by the Ojibwe and so on, but many of the white settlers didn't want the Ojibwe to leave. They were good neighbors, and there was lots of trade, and I think in the 1850s, probably the language of the land was not necessarily English. It was probably Ojibwe. In order to trade and be part of the economy, you had to learn Ojibwe prior to 1850, or you wouldn't be able to do anything. So we'll kind of get back to that, and I'll go on to this next slide here, and this is what you see on the screen is a symbolic petition of the Chippewa chiefs. This was, I think, in 1850 or 1849. This is the Fish Clan. This is the Merman Clan, the Bear Clan, maybe the Martin Clan, and the Crane Clan. And these are individuals, and it shows their clan symbol. And you've got lines from their minds and their hearts to the lakes. And what they were saying is our minds and our hearts are connected to these lands, and we don't want to leave. So they had taken a trip to Washington and sought out the president at the time, asking for them not to force them to move. And that was their petition right there. But the bulk of what is now Minnesota was signed over to the United States government in a series of probably a dozen treaties over about 3 decades in the mid 1800s. Tribes ceded the land in exchange for payments, for reservations, and certain rights. It isn't that they wanted that, but and in fact, in Ojibwe, Ishkonagan is the term for reservation, and that means the leftover. That's kind of the literal translation of what we called reservations in our language, Ishkonagan, the leftovers. And if you think of it in terms of how land is valued, maybe by settlers and so on, they were looking for maybe timberlands or lands that had good resources on them, and the swamps were not desirable. So the Fond du Lac Reservation is 40% wetland or swamp. We've got 100,000 acres here, and 40% of it, or 40,000 acres, is wetland. And so that's kind of how things went. So the creation of White Earth, Leech Lake, Fond du Lac, Grand Portage, Mille Lacs in Minnesota was preceded by the forced relocation and displacement of Native American tribes by the United States government through treaties and policies such as the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And many of these tribes were removed from their traditional lands in the Great Lakes region and moved to designated reservations in the mid-19th century. Reservations were established through a series of treaties and agreements between the tribes and the federal government. And so, white settlement in Minnesota, in the Minnesota area in the 1800s, led to the loss of lands through these cessations and treaties, boarding and mission schools, and led to a period of great suffering for the Ojibwe and other Native peoples. But in many of those treaties, the tribes they insisted on the right to hunt, fish, and gather in the lands that they are ceding to the United States, which meant we get to carry on our way of life. We can hunt, fish, gather. And what they understood was that the United States maybe wanted the tree, but they didn't want the land, or they wanted the mineral, but they didn't want the land. And they couldn't imagine the influx of people that was coming. An example of that is the city of Duluth in 1850. There maybe was 3,000 people, but by 1870, I think the population of Duluth was 70,000 people. So you can imagine, in 20 years, that kind of an increase in population is, I think it was dramatic to see that happen. If you can imagine, I live near a city called Cloquet, Minnesota, and the population there is maybe 12,000 people spread over a fairly big area, but it would be somewhat equivalent to say St. Paul moving to Cloquet, and that happening over a period of 20 years. It's overwhelming. but as I was saying, the tribes retain the right to hunt, fish, and gather, and what they really were wanting was that connection to the land, that, realizing that those relations are the most important in our life and our life ways. So that was what was retained and is still in effect today. I guess maybe what I'll do is stop sharing right now. I see there's a couple questions, and perhaps we can go to the questions. So I'll make an attempt here to stop sharing and see how we do that. Wait,
You
so I
could
see.
you can leave your screen up like this too, and I can just read the questions.
Oh, I guess I can see the questions
If you
here.
can see them now, that's great. Yeah.
Yeah, from Brad Griffith. Is Chippewa considered a subset of the Anishinaabe? And then, however, you mentioned that Chippewa was a name that was given. Is there a correct name for Chippewa? Yeah, Chippewa was like a mispronunciation of Ojibwe, and Ojibwe. We call ourselves Anishinaabe. In other words, we're Anishinaabe. The literal translation is like spontaneous man. We were created. Is how the stories go, and that's kind of the literal translation is Anishinaabe. But I'll tell you, Chippewa or Ojibwe, we're our language is almost the same with the Potawatomi, the Ottawa. I know I have a son-in-law that's Meskwaki, and their language is very close to ours. In fact, Meskwaki in Ojibwe, if we were to translate that, that's Meskwaki is the red earth, and that's what they call their land is the red earth. So yeah, it's Chippewa is a subset of Anishinaabe because they're also we call it the Three Fires Confederacy, and that's the Ojibwe, the Potawatomi, and the Ottawa. Ottawa in Ojibwe, you could translate it as the people that trade, and they were the ones that kind of stayed near Michigan there, and were initially the traders between the French and all of the tribes, and that's how they came up with Ottawa. And the Potawatomi or Budawatomi, they were the fire keepers. The Ojibwe, I think we were known as the medicine keepers, actually. But to answer your question, we are a subset of what's considered Anishinaabe, but in, literally Anishinaabe as a human being. And then I see Brad has another question. Are Ojibwe language classes available in the Twin Cities or online? I'm sure they are available in the Twin Cities. Um, I I know a number of people that, through the university. Um, I'm not sure who's teaching they call it Anishinaabe or Ojibwe, the language of the Ojibwe. Not sure who teaches it down there, but I know that there's lots of students that come from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities that do that, and I'm sure there are language tables as well down in the cities. And Kathleen, is there a distinction between nation and band? Is there a distinction between nation and band? We all call ourselves a nation to some extent because of the idea of sovereignty. We signed treaties with the United States government. Fond du Lac is signatory to a treaty with the United States government. and band, I think we're still struggling with that. Collectively we struggle with that. Um, and I really don't know how to answer that, Kathleen. Yeah, but thank you for your questions. A band, I guess I will say too, a band, like we're the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa, is the moniker that has been put on us. When we deal with the United States government, we call ourselves a nation because we were signatory to a treaty that set aside, a portion that we have for ourselves. So, like I think it's in Europe there, what do they call that? Monterey, or they're a nation. I kind of make the same kind of classification for nation and band as something like that. So I know that isn't answered definitively, but that's the best I can do right now. And I see an anonymous attendee, are more members moving back to live on the reservations, or are they leaving the reservations? We have a number of people that are moving back to the reservations because we have opportunities, employment opportunities and so on. But maybe you're aware too that, there was a relocation effort back in the 50s, and many people left the reservations as a result of that relocation effort that was put out there. The BIA would sponsor somebody to move, and many of our people moved, like, to cities like Cleveland and Chicago, LA, Seattle. I know my dad, he 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 joined the Marines when he was 16. He finished his tour with the Marines. He come back and there was nothing to do, and he joined the Army. And when he come back from there, he went on relocation to Seattle, to Chicago. It was supposed to be a one-way ticket. He got a number of them apparently, but he always come back here, and that's why we're all still here, I guess. But yeah, we have a number of people moving back, a number of people moving out. It's in our population. I've done some things as far as population projections for the band. Um, uh, we're losing populations because of a number of other factors as well. Then we have another question here. If members of Lake Superior Chippewa Reservation, let's see, if the members of the Lake Superior Chippewa Reservation near Grand Marais live on their traditional land, how did that happen? Oh, I see. Lake Superior Chippewa isn't just Fond du Lac. Lake Superior Chippewa were people from Grand Portage, I think Bois Fort, perhaps, Fond du Lac, Red Cliff, Lac de Flambeau, Bad River. They are all considered Lake Superior Chippewa because there was a treaty in 1847 that there were certain parts of that negotiation that created that division as well. The division between the Lake Superior Chippewa and the Mississippi Chippewa. So that's how that goes. I think there was disagreement between we call, in English, chiefs, but Ojibwe, they were the Ogima, they were the ones that maybe listen to the people and take that into consideration, and then negotiate with the powers that be, and that was the United States at the time. And there was some division about what was happening with those negotiations, and the people, say the group that was eventually called the Lake Superior Chippewa had differences from the Ogima from uh like um I think Sandy Lake is considered Mississippi. I'm not certain about that. Leech Lake and so on are Mississippi band. And the people that maybe are from the 1855 uh, um, treaty were considered Mississippi Chippewa. And then how did the Sioux tribes come to live in the southern part of Minnesota and Ojibwe in the northern half? Is there a connection? Yeah, that I was saying earlier that Sioux, they don't like to necessarily be called Sioux. They're and most of the I will call the Sioux tribes Dakota people, and most of them that lived in Minnesota were Dakota. There's uh, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and they speak the same language, but there's some differences there. But as I was saying, many of the Dakota people lived right here in this region in the 1600s, and there was maybe some warfare between the Ojibwe and the Dakotas. And well, I know that there was warfare between the Ojibwe and Dakotas, but there was also, intermarriage as well. And um, and eventually there was forgiveness and so on. And that's how our we have big drum ceremonies throughout, Ojibwe country. And that big drum was given to the Ojibwe by the Dakota people to enjoy peace and 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 live that good life. Um, but how did they get to the southern part of the state? Um, the United States come in and they saw the interaction between the Dakota and the Ojibwe, and they drew a boundary line between them, and that's down there just north of the cities. And that was the Treaty of 1825 or 26, and they call it the Prairie du Chien Treaty. And many of the far northern tribes didn't make it to that treaty, so they had another one, I think, a follow up in 1826 or so up here at Fond du Lac and the old Fond du Lac. I will call it the old Fond du Lac. Nagachiwanang, and Nagachiwanang in Ojibwe means a place where the river comes to a stillness, slows down. So if you're familiar with the St. Louis River or Chigami Zibi, that's how you say that in Ojibwe. That was also called the Grand Portage back in the old days, Gitchi Onigaming. That means Grand Portage. But that was the trade route for everything back in the day, because we traveled by canoe, and you couldn't take the canoe down the Grand Portage because it was too fast. I mean, they have descriptions of the St. Louis River, kind of comparing that to the Niagara Falls as far as the power of the water and so on. In the springtime, the noise was so loud you could hear that from miles away, the water coming down. And in fact, after all the rain we've just had, the rivers are just absolutely flowing right now. But that's how the Dakota people moved to the south. They were out in what's called, Mille Lacs and Sandy Lake. Just Sandy Lake is probably 30-40 miles west of where I live right now in Sawyer. The Dakotas were there in in the mid 1700s, and there was warfare there as well, and that happened up until the mid 1800s, even though there was treaties. So, but that's how the Dakota moved that way. So, thank you. Um, I got my great aunt lived in Waban and was sent to a boarding school. Do you know where those schools actually were? She referred to them as sister school. She lived in Waban, was sent to boarding. Well, there's a number of boarding schools. Pipestone. There was boarding schools in Odena in Wisconsin, boarding schools in Vermilion, and there was boarding schools in North Dakota, South Dakota as well. So there were a lot of boarding schools. I'll kind of get into that in a little bit. And, I'll move on in the presentation here if that's okay. So so yeah, that's the that's a petition to the United States to keep, let us stay where we live. And we'll go on to the next. So we talk about impacts of reservation life. On So the impacts have been significant and complex. Some of the key impacts include, loss of traditional land and resources. Establishment of reservations resulted in the loss of traditional lands and resources, which were essential for their way of life. This has had a profound impact on the ability of Ojibwe communities to maintain traditional forms of subsistence, such as hunting, fishing, and gathering. It really was a disconnect for us from the land. And the economy and the shape of the economy is totally contrary to our way of being. We up until the mid 1800s, we relied on the land for everything. Even in my dad's lifetime, my dad was born in 1929. They would make soap out of bear fat and deer fat, and they had a house, but the generation before him, my grandfather, he was born in Sandy Lake in 1898, and he was born in a wigwam. And like the question earlier, where was that boarding school at? Unfortunately, they took him when he was like 7 years old and sent him to boarding school in Pipestone. But I'll get into that too. But impacts of reservation life. So they're all sent to the reservation. I know I have my grandma's cousin. He passed away probably in the late 80s, 1980s. But he was telling me that he remembered when we all lived, at Nagachi-Wanang, or where the river slows down, and that's at the bottom of the hill going into the estuary in Duluth and in the harbor there. And he said there were trails that led up to the reservation. The treaty was in 1854, but many of the people of Fond du Lac didn't come to Fond du Lac immediately. They stayed and hunted and fished and so on in those ceded territories until, the population of Duluth got, in the 1870s, somewhere near 70,000 people. It kind of drove them west to the reservation lands. And I should say too, in 1860 or thereabouts, that was 6 years after the treaty was made, they could see the surveyors going, marking the boundary lines for the reservation. And the people said, no, that isn't what we agreed to. they could see them pounding in like cedar stakes for the south boundary. And they said, you're not going to even include our rice lakes. And if the boundary is here. So our reservation was supposed to go to the Savannah River, which is up near Floodwood, Minnesota, and include like Prairie Lake and all of that. And it was the reservation was supposed to be at least 100,000 acres. And I think it was, probably much more than that as far as we understood it and the physical boundaries that were negotiated during the treaty making. But as they were putting in the southern boundaries, they said, no, you're not including our rice lakes. We have to include them. So they said, okay, we'll make an adjustment. And they moved the boundary line, or that boundary line south to include the rice lakes that, I've got one a half a mile behind my house, and there's, 3 or 4 that are within 5 miles of where I live right now that we depend on for monomen and wild rice. And that's been our staple as far as food goes for hundreds of years. And so that was included, but they cut off most of the western boundary, and that was probably 40,000 acres. And so that's how that went. So impacts of reservation life. Like I say, disruption of social and cultural traditions. We're confined to the reservation. It also had economic challenges. Reservation life has often resulted in economic challenges for many communities. There's high rates of poverty, unemployment, and lack of access to basic services. And this makes it difficult for our community members to maintain their traditional way of life. And it's not necessarily economically viable in the modern world. Also, health and wellness impacts. Reservation life has also had impacts on health and wellness. I don't know if people know about historical trauma, environmental degradation, and lack of access to quality healthcare services. We used to have an Indian hospital here in Fond du Lac, and many people were born here. They were taken, from like I know that a lot of people from Bois Forte come to the Indian hospital here in Fond du Lac in the 40s and 50s, and many of them were born here in our hospital. But they tore that down in the early 60s, and we've subsequently built up quite a modern clinic here on Fond du Lac, and it works well to keep our health kind of a priority for us. But that was our own doing. It wasn't the BIA or anything else, although we get help from them. So despite those challenges, many Indian communities have shown resilience and adaptability in reservation life. We've like for Fond du Lac, we have a cultural building. We also have language tables so that we can start using the language again. We have economic development and our we put a big focus of any of the revenues that come from gaming into our health services as well. So we're making adjustments, and I'll go on to the next slide, I guess. Well, this is a picture of my grandfather and this is his half sister. They were both sent to Pipestone. As I was saying, he was born in 1898, and in Sandy Lake in a wigwam. And I think at early age, probably 6 or 7, he was sent to Pipestone boarding school, as well as his sister, who was probably 2 years younger than him. And she became a nurse, and I think she went to Haskell which is another boarding school, and Haskell, Nebraska. And she learned to be a nurse, and I think she moved on to Wichita, Kansas. And so maybe her grandchildren live in Wichita now. But my grandfather, I'd written to the National Archives and got some of the correspondence between his family and him when he was in Pipestone. It would cost him $5 to catch a train to get back to his home, and they couldn't afford it, so he had to stay and spend the summers working for farmers in the Pipestone area. But as you can see, he learned how to be a plumber and pipe fitter, so he had a skill when he got out of Pipestone, and he worked all over the place. I think he probably in the 50s he may have went to like Cleveland and so on to do pipe fitting, but he retained his you can see the shell here, that's for smudging and so on, he knew the language. He was fluent in the language. He hunted, fished. What he would do too, like I say, we retain the right to hunt, fish, and gather. He was a pipe fitter, so he would work construction, and it didn't matter. It's probably contrary to many of the construction trades and expectations, but if it was hunting season, he would quit working and go hunting. Or if it was ricing season, he would quit working and go ricing, and that was priority for him. So that the will to endure, I think we're a living testament to the tenacity of our culture, and the will to endure or even flourish. Our language and so on was he was forbidden to use the language when he was going to Pipestone, um, and my dad said that they would talk in Ojibwe in order for them not to know what they were speaking about, but eventually he was teaching me Anishinaabe when I was a young kid, and then took great pride in that. So yeah, we have a desire to endure. And then we'll go to the next slide here. I think resistance to assimilation efforts. This was driven by a desire to maintain our cultural identity and protect our land and resources, also address historic trauma, and uphold our sovereignty and self-determination. One of the things that kind of kicked that off was the American Indian movement, and this was founded by a number of grassroots activists in Minneapolis in 1968, and they sought to improve conditions for Indians who would move to the cities as a result of relocation, and it grew into an international movement. And the goals were full restoration of tribal sovereignty and treaty rights. And that was the first time, I think, in the 60s, late 60s and 70s, that you would see anything that, any kind of movement, positive movement for Indians. And I attribute that to, the efforts of the American Indian movement. And they had a long campaign of confrontation politics, but I think they're credited with restoring hope to our people. And eventually they used our ancestors' spiritual practices and got people thinking about getting back into that Mino Bimadaziwan, that good life. And that's our resistance to assimilation and those kind of efforts. Yeah. And then this is in the United States, there was a Dawes Act that was actually was 1887, but the act here in Minnesota was called the Nelson Act, and that was 1889. And that was it was also known as the General Allotment Act, and the law authorized the president to break up reservation land, which was held in common by members of the tribe, broke it up into small allotments to be parceled out to individuals. And any Indians on the registered on the tribal rolls were granted allotments of reservation land. And the allotment policies had many negative effects on Ojibwe people. And these policies aimed to assimilate Indians into mainstream America by dividing reservation land into individual plots. Yeah. So the impacts were loss of land, the disruption of traditional way of life, many economic hardships as a result of that. Also cultural erosion, forced assimilation in the Ojibwe people through the allotment policies. Overall, the Allotment Act, like I say, led to loss of land, disruption of traditional way of life, economic hardships, and cultural erosion. My grandfather, the one I showed you there, he was allotted land on White Earth. I don't know why they did that. He was from Sandy Lake, but I think they told him he'd have to be enrolled in White Earth. He was telling me that they took his land for $1 and other there was a term they used. But anyway, they took anything that he was allotted for $1 and other valuable considerations, is how they put it on the deed. And he said they stole his land, basically. So, and the Indian Reorganization Act, this was 1934 that the Indian Reorganization Act happened, and that was kind of the federal government saying, geez, they're losing all their land. Like Fond du Lac had 100,000 acres initially, and because of the Allotment Act, which was put in place in the 1880s, by 1930s they'd lost about 80% of their land base. By that was just 30 years, they lost 80% of the land base on the reservation. And so this set up a new organizational model for governments for Indians in Minnesota, and this also created the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe. And it also kind of provided a template constitution. It wasn't anything that the people had put together. It was something the federal government kind of imposed on the people of the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe to govern ourselves. And it was done pretty much lack of consultation with any Indians. They just said, this is the constitution you're going to go by. And like I say, all of the Minnesota Chippewa tribes, each one of them have that. Well, they had all of what I described initially, the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, that they give us the constitution without any input from us. And that constitution was also given to the tribes in North Dakota, Montana, Washington, and so on. It was a template that the federal government used so that they could deal with tribes easier. And that's how our governments are formed. And I think currently we have constitution. I'm part of the constitutional delegates that are looking to reform the Constitution of the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe as well, and we're trying to make it organic or from us rather than something that's imposed on us. And we'll have a vote on that in the near future, I believe. So we're moving along there. That's the idea of self-determination. So I'll go into the next slide here. Cultural preservation and resiliency. I think I'll read a quote, and this is from one of the Ogimas from, actually he was from Fond du Lac. There's a big story about this. Biaswa was his name. He was a chief of the Ojibwe, and he lived initially where the Brule River comes out of the Lake Superior, and he moved to Fond du Lac here, and this is his quote when they were trying to force treaties on him. He's saying, "Our home is here in the right spot. There's no better place. We are safe here from any prowling bands. We don't have to go out into the lake for fish. They swim up the river to us, and all that we have to do is take them out of the water. The weather is good here most of the year. When it gets cold in midwinter, there are plenty of sheltered spots, and all sorts of dry wood is more easily found here than elsewhere. Where our white birch trees for bark are more plenty. Where are white birch trees for bark more plenty? Where do the birds have softer feathers, and where do the animals have richer, warmer furs? I would not live nor be contented in any other place. It's grand here. If one goes to the east, he sets sail on the Great Lakes for days, safe from all danger, seeing new lands and enjoying the fresh air. If one goes to the west, he comes to a great river and no end of lakes full of rice. If he goes further west, he gets out of the forest and into the big prairie, where herds of buffalo roam. If one goes to the south, he finds 100 streams full of beavers and some kind of good small fish that don't go into the lake. There are no end of maple trees for sap, and many, excuse me, and many sweet fruits that way. If one goes north, he sees moose almost as easy to get as buffalo. There are many good spots for safe camps. So this is the center of all good things. Do not coax me to leave, for it would be a waste of breath." And that was Biaswa, one of the chiefs of Fond du Lac, and I think later he had sons that were chiefs out at Sandy Lake as well. But the Minnesota Chippewa Tribes have taken various steps to revive cultural practices and preserve our language. And some of the initiatives they have put in place include, like cultural programs and events. The tribes organize cultural programs, events, and workshops to educate community members about their traditions, practices, and language. And these events often include traditional ceremonies, storytelling, dancing, and other cultural activities. We also have language immersion programs. The tribes have established language immersion programs for both children and adults to learn and speak the language. And these programs aim to ensure the language is passed on to future generations and prevent its extinction. Also, we have tribal museums and cultural centers. Many of the tribes have established museums and cultural centers to showcase and preserve their history, artifacts, and traditional practices. And then we have traditional arts and crafts. The tribes support traditional arts and crafts such as beadwork, quillwork, birch bark basketry, and lots of collaboration with educational institutions. Like Fond du Lac is a Fond du Lac Tribal and Community College. Red Lake has a college. I think Leech Lake does as well. And I believe Mille Lacs is working towards that. So the Minnesota Chippewa Tribes made significant efforts to revive cultural practices and preserve the language and ensure that our rich heritage continues to thrive for generations to come. So this is a symbol of the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe. You can see on the bottom, it says Nimama Winamin. That means we all come together. And established June 18th, 1934. That was, like I say, when the Indian reorganization was put in place. And the symbol is something that we put in there, at the very least. But many people of, many Ojibwe people my age, my generation grew up poor, and until the growth of tribal governments in the 60s and the jobs they created, there was little in the way of work for many Ojibwe communities. Without jobs in the community, there's little hope. So many people left the reservation for urban areas, and like in the 50s, and they continued to live in poverty where they are holding low wage jobs in those areas. So from the late 60s until the early 90s, the economic landscape improved as tribal governments expanded the education, human services, and healthcare for the people of their community. Some tribes operated, like small construction companies, landfills, stores, and other small businesses. But it wasn't until the advent of the Indian Regulatory Gaming Act in 1988 that tribal governments achieved their greatest impact as far as economic development goes. So not since the fur trade have Ojibwe entrepreneurs affected the regional economy so profoundly. Ojibwe reservations in Minnesota operate 13 of the 18 casino resorts throughout the state. And according to Minnesota Indian Gaming, tribal governments and casinos employ about 21,000 people and supply $576 million in wages and $500 million in services and goods. And this creates, about $330 million in capital projects that are happening. And tribes expend almost $1.5 billion that stimulate the economy in our regions. So yeah, that having an ability to earn a living creates hope, and or a sense of hope that hasn't been felt in our communities in many generations. So and that about concludes my presentation. I guess I would open it for questions, or I see we've got a number of questions in the chat. So I'll I don't know if people can. Is the audio on? Here's a question. Can you recommend a good book on pre-contact history? I'm especially interested in the migration from east to west. Let's see, a good book on pre-contact history. I think there's an author by the name of Diamond that wrote the book 1491. I've read that, but it's been a few years since I've read it. But that tells a whole lot about pre-contact. Did I say the name of that? Oh yeah, 1491. This is the name of the book. And
I'll
I
find
can't
it and
think
put
of
a link
anything.
in the chat quickly.
Pardon me?
I'll find it and I'll put a link in the chat for everybody.
Yeah,
In a minute.
I just there are a whole bunch of authors that talk, that touch on pre-contact. I just can't think of them right now. I'm sorry. Um, so next question, there's an online Ojibwe class with the Minnesota Housing Coalition. My daughter and I take it. The teacher is from Red Lake. Oh yeah. Um, yeah, there's a number of online Ojibwe classes, and they're pretty good. I think I periodically join one with her name is Wendy Genius. She's also an author of a number of books. I think she wrote the book Plants. You know, they have a lot to offer. All you have to do is ask. That's really a pretty cool book about our relationship with the plants. And like I say, she offers. I think she's teaching out of Canada, but if you looked up Wendy, and I think you spell her last name Geniiuz, but she teaches out of a college in Canada. But it it's like I say, it's online, and I believe it's free, and she does a good job. And there are a number of others. Sutherland, I can't think of his first name right now. His mom is Mary Moose. He does an online class through the University of Minnesota as well. I think he still does. And Fond du Lac's own Ricky Defoe does an online. He does it via Zoom, I believe. But if you did a search for Ricky Defoe Ojibwe, I think you could find it. So, a question here, can you explain how Red Lake is different? Oh, yeah, Red Lake is not a part of the Minnesota Chippewa Tribe because their chiefs at the time said, we're not going to divide up our land. We're going to continue to own this collectively, and we won't divide our land. So Red Lake is not allotted at all. It's every Red Lake band member is owner of their land. There's no, I own this square feet of land here. And and traditionally, that's the way Ojibwe's worldview was. It's as foreign as, I don't know, you probably can't see me. I don't think you can see me, but if I said this square, and I'm holding my hands up in the air with it, like in a circle, and if I said this square inch of air is, I'm going to sell this square inch of air. That's pretty foreign to us today, but in effect, we're really starting to think about doing that, and that's what they're talking about as far as carbon credits go. So yeah, owning land was completely contrary to the worldview. You can't own the land, is how it was viewed back in the day. The land, Earth is our mother. That's the way it was looked at, and we have a responsibility to take care of and live in balance with that. Here are two books from this is Elsa's got it. Yeah. Yeah, Anton Troyer, great Minnesota author. He's good. And then Elsa, I think you put in there, plants have so much to give us. All we have to do is ask. Yeah. Great.
Yeah, the Amazon link in there's for the 1491 book.
Oh, I didn't see that one. Is that like one of the first ones, or?
Yeah, I didn't write the label in there, but I can put it again. But we also have two other questions back in the Q&A section if you want to look at those too while I get the other link back.
Where are they?
In the Q&A section, I can read them again for you.
Yeah, if you would.
So from an anonymous one, we have, so you prefer to pronounce it Fond du Lac versus Fond du Lac, as many people have heard it. Is there a reason behind that, or is there a difference?
You know, I imagine pronounce it Fond du Lac. We're we say Fond du Lac. I say Fond du Lac. I don't know. You know, that's just, you know, the local uh the local way of saying it, Fond du Lac.
All right, then we have another one from Noah, who says, "My family has a farm near Pillager that has been operating since 1898. I think that the land was a part of the 1847 treaty. Are there resources you'd recommend where I could learn more about the treaty specifically, or period between 1840s and 1890s in that area?"
When you say pillager, I'm gonna stop sharing here, okay? And how is that? Can you see me?
Yep, we can see you again. Yep.
Yeah. So when you say pillager, where is that? Pillager is, I'm not certain where that is. And I'm not seeing the question on here.
Yeah. On the bottom of your screen, there's the Q&A button again. I don't know where Pillager is either. Noah, if you want to add any other points.
Q&A. Oh, I see. Okay, my family has a farm near Pillager that has been operating since 1898. It was more than likely part of the 1855 treaty, I would believe.
Apparently it's near
1840s,
Staples and Motley. Not sure what
Staples and
county.
Motley. Yeah,
West of
I'm pretty
Raymond.
sure that was the 1855 treaty. Um, and where can you find more on the 1855 treaty? Let's see. Are there resources I could learn more about this treaty? Yeah, I would. You know, if you went to the Becker County, there's a whole story there about how they kind of forged a road to where White Earth is, and this was back in 1860s. Um, and the person that did that was contracted, and like I say, they tilled up a whole bunch of land and cut up a lot of wood and so on in preparation for the establishment of White Earth. But that area that you're talking, that was ceded during the 1855 treaty. So I would look up the 1855 treaty if you're looking for information about, you know, what the details there were. And I have a ancestor. His name was Iabadwewidung, and he was from Sandy Lake, and he was signatory to the 47 treaty and the actually it was the 1863 treaty with the Mississippi. But in 18, you know, I was saying earlier that, you know, in 1889 they were going around trying to get people to sign up for the Allotment Act, and he just said, "No, I'm not going to deal with you, and I won't sign it because I know your record." You know, I probably didn't say it like that, but that's kind of what he said is, "No, you're not trustworthy. I'm not going to sign it, so no deal." And he was the only one that probably didn't back. Well, he was adamantly against it, and he was, you know, like I said, signatory to the 47. He was a Iabadwewidung was his name, and from Sandy Lake. He was like the warrior or the, you know, the helper to the chief. And then in the 63, he was the chief as well. So, but he just said, nope, ain't gonna do it. I see we got another question, or is that the same one?
No, no, we have one more here.
Oh, with regard to cultural preservation and resiliency, is there collaboration between, oh yeah, nowadays there is a lot of collaboration between the Ojibwe and the Dakota. And like I say, the word Chippewa and Sioux are probably derogatory. You know, I know there's not meant to be, but like the Sioux, I think they were named the Sioux because Nadawe Sioux, and I think that means snake in one of the languages. And they didn't like that, but it ended up being the Sioux. And Chippewa, they couldn't say Ojibwe or Anishinaabe, so it ended up being Chippewa. But no, there's a lot of um, collaboration between the Dakota people and the Ojibwe. In fact, like I was saying, our drum ceremonies are they happen in the spring and in the fall, and they happen on probably on many of the reservations, both here in Minnesota and Wisconsin, because the Dakota people or Sioux provided a drum that was received via a vision that somebody significant in their tribe had, so that there would be peace among us. So, yeah, there's lots of collaboration, I would have to say.
All right. Well, if you have anyone has any other questions, you can always reach out to the White Bear Historical Society and we can help you find the answer, or we can get you in contact with Wayne too if you have specific questions. But thank you all very much for joining our presentation today. And of course, thank you to Wayne for all your expertise and personal stories. It's very, very meaningful and very educational too at the same time. So thank you very much.
Miigwech, Gigawabam, and thank you, and we'll see you again sometime.
Yes. All right. Have a good night, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.